All right, so we're going to be starting with our offshore, prepping for offshore panel. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to just ask everyone to head over to your chat function and tell us if you are crew, if you want to be crew, or if you're looking for crew, so that our panelists can have a sense of who's in the audience today. Also, while each panelist speaks, we ask that you head over to the Q&A function and ask questions for each panelist, and we'll try to answer a few after each person talks, but also we'll answer questions at the end as well. So first up, we're going to hear from Captain Nancy Erley, who was a captain of 2 5-year-long all-women circumnavigations on board her beloved Orca 38 Tethys, which has served as an ocean sailing classroom for 65 different women. She holds a U.S. Coast Guard 100-ton Master of Oceans license and is an instructor evaluator oceans for the International Sail and Power Association, and received both U.S. and NWSA's Leadership in Women Sailing Award in 2006. Nancy and Tethys teach women from a home port of Port Townsend, Washington. Our second panelist who we'll hear from is Linda Newland, and Linda holds the fastest woman single-handed record from San Francisco to Japan. She has sailed and raced extensively on the West Coast and sailed single-handed Transpac to Hawaii twice, and is a veteran of the LA to Honolulu Transpac and Pacific Cup. In 1997, on her own boat, she skippered an all-women's crew in the LA to Honolulu Transpac, taking second place in the division finish. And our third panelist will be Behan Gifford, who sailed south from the Pacific Northwest in 2008 with her husband and 3 children on board Totem, a Stevens 47. Their sabbatical plans morphed into an open-ended adventure with the 48 countries and territories visited so far. She is currently cruising the Pacific side of Mexico and is hoping to head on a second circumnavigation soon. So we're going to start with Nancy.
Hello, everyone. It's good morning here from the Northwest, but perhaps good afternoon where you're from. I just want to tell you what a powerful panel you've got here with us. My background is with All Women on My Boat as a teaching platform. Linda is a racer, as you can tell. And in fact, she's done many races as the captain with all men crew, although she said on one of them there was one woman crew, okay? So she's learned how to run a ship as the captain with men as her crew and trying to win the races, okay, which she's done pretty well. And then Behan brings up a third perspective of cruising around the world with your family, with your husband, and all the things that entails. And they've brought on temporary crew sometimes too to help. And they are consultants in offshore cruising. So she'll be a resource for you in the future too. All right, it's a roundtable discussion. We only have an hour. We invite participation, and perhaps after each of us gives our session, you'll get a chance to have your questions answered, but go ahead and put them in the question and answer box down there. I'm going to talk a little bit about setting the context here, which I'm calling the profoundness and the inner journey. The adventure of an ocean passage. Why would you even want to do it? There's no real safety net. Each day brings with it a certain amount of unpredictability. Your sleep pattern is broken by night watches. You're living in a confined space, often with strangers, and the motion of the boat is relentless. And when the weather's up, it's been described as standing in a small dark closet with a large wet dog. However, the closet's pretty still and the boat is going to be rattling you all around. So these things are all true, and yet the sea still calls to us. I'm called because each day brings new wonders and often new challenges. I need to dig deep and improvise and keep us all safe and headed toward our destination. I look for my crew to contribute in the same way to the success and happiness of the voyage. One might call it character building. I want a happy ship where each person feels valued because they're contributing to the safety and joy of voyaging together. So what do you need to know to be prepared? You're a crew member, not a passenger. Your strengths are your contribution. Use your strengths to contribute. Your strengths are what you feel you can help with above and beyond what's really expected. It might be as modest as sweeping the floor every day because you notice it and feel it will add to the happiness of the ship. Maybe someone threw up in the head. Probably they did. And you go in there and clean it up, even though it wasn't your responsibility. Be a keen observer and report sounds or smells or anything you think odd to the captain. So that's one of the big takeaways, is to be a keen observer, no matter what your skill set is. Also, get yourself some experience before you go on your first offshore passage. It's like a chicken and an egg. You have to get the passage somehow. So to make yourself more comfortable on the passage and more attractive as a crew member, be sure you know some sailing and something about boating, and then Behan's going to give you some ways of getting on your first berth towards the end of this. I found that on nearly every passage on Tethys, the women have each tried to essentially outdo each other by contributing to our happy ship. I think this is actually how women are. I'm going to take questions now. Anyway, if there are any questions for me, and we're looking for Linda.
Linda is on. We don't have any questions as of yet.
Okay, good. I think you will in the next section or two. So as I said, Linda's an ocean racer. So she brings the racing perspective in all this, and dealing with often very many strangers on her boat, or being on a boat that's strange to her too. Take it away, Linda.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in this morning. Yes, my experience has been more for taking a cruise from San Francisco to Hawaii on pack cup races, done Transpac, and I've done a lot of deliveries of my own boat, bringing it back from Hawaii, and also deliveries for skippers, hiring me to bring their boat back. And a lot of times I've had a mixture of crews, mostly men, occasionally a woman, but crews that are inexperienced versus experienced. And so it's a mixture. And so trying to get everybody on the same page and understanding what their responsibilities are is something that I like to say happens before you leave the dock. I'm going to do 5 different key points that I think are important, but I'm going to be telling this more from the perspective of the captain. But as people are listening and are thinking about being potential crew members, think about some of the things I'm going to say and ask yourself, if you're thinking of going offshore yourself with someone, is the person in charge of the boat, did they cover a lot of these things before you left the dock? If they're not covering some of these things, then you should be concerned. Brief the crew on the rules to live by, including all the safety equipment before you leave, so everybody is on the same page. And that may be a review for people that have been out there before, and it might be some new stuff for the newbies that you're taking on board. I also use what I call SOP, Standard Operating Procedure, and I have written lists all over the boat, taped up to the bulkheads, on how to use the propane stove, how to where all the emergency equipment is, how to deploy emergency equipment, how to make a mayday call if necessary. If I'm incapacitated, I need somebody else on the boat that can read a sign and follow directions. So I have these taped all over. It drives people crazy. Also have a SOP for where all the through holes are on the boat in case we're taking on water. One of the things that I do before I get into my rules is to have what I call my priorities. And I tell them, first priority is crew safety, obviously. Second priority is boat maintenance, and third priority is your personal convenience, which comes as a little surprise to some people that haven't been out there. The first point I want to make is I say a healthy crew is a happy crew. When people get on the boat, they've got to relay to me all of their health issues. I need to know because sometimes life depends on someone else knowing. I need to know where their medications are. If something happens and they're non-responsive, I need to know where to find them. And I need to know if they're blind, deaf, or whatever, because I've had that happen where I put people on a foredeck that can't hear, and they haven't told me that they can't hear. Crew assignments are going to be dependent on people's health issues. Probably not surprising to most people, seasickness is the primary problem. And I've had people tell me, I don't get seasick. But that's not true. Everybody can get seasick at some point, depending on the circumstances. So it's demoralizing to the rest of the crew if someone is seasick and is unable to hold their watch and do their work, because it puts an undue burden on the rest of the people. So I'm very careful to make sure that people bring their own seasick medication. And I tell them before we leave, if you don't bring it and you get seasick to a point where you're endangering your own safety, because it can be life-threatening, then I will actually put a scopolamine patch on. And I've done that a couple of different times where the person says, well, I don't want to take any drugs. And it's like, well, you've got to a point now where you don't have a choice. You will be taking it. And you put one on. The scopolamine patch, a lot of people don't like, but the one thing that has an advantage over others is that with the patch, it goes through the skin into your system, so you don't have to worry about keeping a pill down that you're trying to swallow for seasickness. My story that goes along with my seasickness is my first trip to Hawaii was double-handed with another fellow in 1978. He was a single-handed sailor and named Bob Whitney. And I think Bob's passed now, so I can talk about it. But we left Monterey, and he'd been in a single-handed race and had equipment failure. And so he dropped out of the race and then decided he wanted someone to go with him. And so I jumped up. I knew him through the yacht club. I never sailed with him. Thought, well, if he was in a single-handed race, he must know what he's doing. Unfortunately, an hour out of Monterey on our way to Hawaii on this Ranger 29, he got terribly seasick, went down below, got in his bunk, grabbed a bucket and started heaving in his bucket. He didn't leave that bunk for 4 days. And I got to empty his bucket on a regular basis, which wasn't fun. Plus I got to run the boat. So basically I single-handed the boat for 4 days. At that time, I did not know celestial navigation. And so that led me to the next step in my life once I got off the boat. To learn that. Sometimes you've got to do your homework on who you go with, and seasickness can really debilitate a person. Actually, I found the solution after 4 days because I was getting tired of doing the work. So I found through his first aid manual that he really needed some salt tablets, and that brought him out of that. So the takeaway on that one is crew bring their own seasick medications, or the captain helps you with that. The second big item for putting a lot of people on the boat that don't know each other necessarily is they've got to adjust to a lack of privacy. You've got one head usually on boat, and you've got maybe 6 or 7 people, and I've had 10 on board. After a few days, if it's a saltwater heads start to smell. So I like to tell people I'd rather have them be rail trained. Race crews understand rail trained. That means you go outside, you go over the rail and do your thing. You got to tie yourself on, you got to have your tether on, of course, for safety. This comes as a big shock to new sailors. They are somewhere between horrified and resistant to rail training. And so then there's the bucket backup. My story is the Pacific Cup yacht race from San Francisco to Hawaii. I had 10 people on a 41-foot boat, and I told them that we were going to do rail training, and they were horrified because all of them had never done an ocean blue water crossing before. So I compromised with that crew. So they brought a bucket that fit inside the head toilet on the boat. And so they didn't have to pump the salt water through to get the bad smells. So they lined the bucket with barf bags from an airline. And so the guys would go in and use the head. I used the rail on the outside. They used the head in their bucket, and they didn't have to carry the bucket through the main salon. That had a few issues attached to that in rough weather, which I won't go into. But be as it may, head training is very important. Even if they say they know how to use one and you do allow them to use it, make sure that you watch them do it. The third point I wanted to make is on watch systems. Nancy mentioned that. Watch system is a little tough on people that don't normally get up in the middle of the night, because everybody on board has to adjust to the 24/7, not only the motion of the boat, but the fact that somebody has to be on deck, whether it's usually two people on a race crew. It's really tough to have someone wake you up at midnight. It's black, the boat's heaving around. You're trying to get your clothes on in 20 minutes to get out on the deck. You're out there for 3 hours usually, and some people have shorter watches depending on the conditions. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, before the sun comes up, you're back down in your bunk. So that's the worst watch of all, I think, the midnight to 3. It's a rotation. It takes a few days for people to get into it. And I try to explain this to a crew. You can explain the experience of doing these watches. So what I do is always have a shakedown trip first before you do the long trip. Take them out overnight. You got to take them into some rough weather. Let them experience what it's like to get up in the middle of the night and go through all the gyrations that they're going to have to do. My story for this one has to do more with night vision. I had to get one of my crew up on a shakedown in the middle of the night. All the crew were told to bring little red personal lights, because a red light down below doesn't destroy your night vision. You need your night vision when you go up to steer or do any other work on board. This particular crew member was a young fellow, great sailor, sailed in San Francisco Bay, fine, hadn't been out on the ocean before, and he had used a white light instead of a red light down below, which I was unaware of. So he destroyed his night vision, came up on the deck. Unfortunately, I was out there. I didn't have him sit down for 10 or 15 minutes and do something else. I put him on the wheel right away. And we were in 40 knots. We were bashing to weather off the Farallones, outside the Farallones, up toward going north. And he took the wheel and he just steered straight up the face of about a 10-foot wave and launched the boat airborne off the backside of the wave. And we hit the trough behind that wave. It snapped the mast forward. We had runners on the mast, and they were tied into a metal tow rail on this CNC 41. And the force of the brute force of hitting that trough and snapping the mast forward ripped the piece of tow rail right through the fiberglass of the boat, bolts and all, and went sailing out into Never Never Land. That was a big wake-up call. It levitated the people in their bunks down below. Everybody hit the deck. Fortunately, we didn't lose the mast, and we were able to make repairs and continue on our way. That's just one of the reasons it's a good idea to do a shakedown ahead of time and to be aware of what goes on with the night lights and ruining your night vision. That was my takeaway, shakedown cruise. Also, if there's a person on board that really doesn't want to do the race after that, they can get off the boat. I've had that happen. My fourth scenario is sharing space with fellow crew. And this doesn't happen for families sailing together or small crews, but in a race crew, typically nobody has their own bunk. I mean, everybody has to share bunk space. We call it hot bunking. So usually 2 crew members share the same space. So there's a lot of rules that go along with this in tight quarters. No food in the bed, pick up your dirty laundry, stow it somewhere in watertight, waterproof bags. Also, keep your clothes picked up, put them in your sea bag. You can't strew your personal stuff around. Personal hygiene is critical. And you're working with a big crew. And if there's somebody, and there's usually somebody on board that you have to talk to, it's better that the crew doesn't tell them. It's better the crew tells the skipper talks to this person. There's always a way to keep clean and good smelling, even if you can't have a full bath. Another thing that happens is people, if they're not explained, you can't just bring everything that you own at home on the boat. So for racing, we have weight limits. I bring a scale down to the dock and I tell them, this is your limit. Usually it's 25 pounds. You go over 25, then you're going to have to take something out of your bag. Another way to handle weight limits is issue the same size bag for each of the crew members. And what they can stuff in the bag, they can bring, and that's it. I was navigating my own boat, and I had an all-women crew in the LA Transpac in '97. And the rule was pick up your stuff or it goes overboard. And I had one crew member who never could pick her stuff up. So we kept telling her and we kept giving her chances. And finally, we tripped over her shoes one night in the dark and those went overboard. Fortunately, she had a second pair of shoes, but she was not happy about losing her shoes. But there's just sometimes that you just have to follow the rules, and that was one of them. The rules on watch systems, very important. And if you have to do hot bunking, be sure and cover that before you leave the dock. There's some people that really don't like doing that. And the final consideration kind of goes back to something that Nancy had mentioned earlier, psychological considerations. You want to try to keep the crew happy. Picture on the screen now is of Gatecrasher. That's where I had 10 on board this 41-foot boat. You try to tell people, try to keep it positive. Everybody's going to have a down day on board. And that's fine. Just let everybody else know you're having a down day, but don't take it out on people. Let us know. We'll just kind of give you your space and you can work through it. And that usually is fine. I love having somebody on board that has a sense of humor, and because a lot of times humor really saves the day when everybody's feeling down. The other psychological issue is no alcohol, no illegal drugs. I haven't gone through people's bags, but anything that's mood altering, if it's something that's prescribed, I want to know about it, but otherwise, none of the other. If I bring a bottle of wine for a halfway party, that's one thing, but nobody else can bring that stuff. Bring favorite snacks, and please don't use the time on the boat to break a bad habit. I've had people say, well, this is a perfect time. I'm away from the shore. I'm out here isolated. I think I'll stop smoking. No, bad, very bad plan, because that is certainly going to affect your mood and it's going to affect the rest of us too. So don't break bad habits. And I like to try to give the crew things to do when they're off watch if they're bored. A lot of people like to read, so they don't really need to be entertained. But, you know, for us, you can put a fishing line over the back. That's not going to slow you down that much. When we're doing deliveries coming back from Hawaii, we look for the glass Japanese fishing balls. We do navigational challenges. We do treasure hunts. There's always something missing on a boat somewhere. And so we do fishing, treasure hunts. My final story for people that have really lost it isn't my crew, but I was on the water in a single-handed race while there was the first crewed Pacific Cup race. And one of the boats in that race had a skipper who was unfortunately diabetic, alcoholic, and I don't know what else, and he was a smoker. And he didn't tell the crew any of this. He decided he was going to break some habits on his way to Hawaii. And one of his habits, unfortunately, was he didn't bring his insulin along. Several days out, I heard the Mayday call, not the call from the boat, but I heard the Coast Guard response, so I knew there were problems. and I didn't know how far away I was from the boat. But the crew had to tie the skipper down and secure him in his bunk with duct tape because he had tried to jump overboard, and then he pulled a knife and went after the crew. And they were terrified that they were going to get charged with mutiny by securing him. And so the Coast Guard interceded and sent a ship, and they picked the fellow up off the boat and let the crew continue to sail. But he just went bonkers. And I've talked personally to several of the crew members, and it was a very frightening time for them and for everyone. Don't try to break bad habits. That's the other thing. And know your people. And again, going back to the health things, everybody needs to share so everybody knows what's going on. So anyway, that concludes my comments.
Thank you so much, Linda. We have some questions for you.
Okay.
To answer quickly. So our first one is, how do you know when you're truly ready to depart on a trans-ocean race or cruise?
Well, after I do the shakedown, I have a pretty good idea of where the weak links are. So we work on some of those. If they need more practice, I step it up. But usually on a race, you don't have a choice of when you leave. You leave when the race starts. So you try to start early and getting your crew ready. And usually that means several months in advance. So you've got to know who your crew are and get them ready if you've got an experienced crew.
Wonderful. Joan would like to know, what if a person is allergic to the patch? Like, have you had any experience with that?
I haven't, but I have had experience, not with allergic, but with people getting too much of a dose. And although the instructions say do not cut it in half, I've cut it even in quarters. I had a crew member once that was overly medicated, even with half a patch. And so we put a quarter and she was fine with that.
Okay. Great. So our next question is, even though chances are small of hitting large underwater debris, a sleeping whale, or an unmarked reef, is there affordable sonar to detect and warn you in time to avoid?
Not when you're traveling sailing at high speeds in a race. I mean, you're sailing a boat, probably, depending on the size boat, of course, but you're talking 10 to 15 plus knots. So at night, there's no way of seeing any kind of obstruction, especially if you've got wave action. You can't see it. I mean, you're just flying blind. So that's just one of the challenges of racing, and you just take what you get and make sure that you've got all your equipment on board for repairs and that sort of thing. And most of the organized races, they require so much extra equipment and ways to repair the boat that if you've got a jury rig something and patch a hole, you've got that stuff on board. But really, I mean, obviously, if you hit a container that's just floating out there in the middle of the night, you're probably going to sink the boat. So you do have a life raft, and hopefully you've got an EPIRB and you've got tracking devices so you can get saved.
All right, I've got one last question for you right now, and I'll save the others till the end so we have enough time for Behan. Debbie wants to know, if when you were the only woman on board, how did you deal with having enough privacy while racing? Did you have your own berth, or did you have to hot bunk?
I had, my first mate was an instructor at a sailing school. He hadn't done any blue water racing, but he was my first mate. And so we split the watches. So I oversaw a certain number of people on my watch. He oversaw the others. So he was, when I was up, he was down. And so we hot bunked, the two of us. As far as personal privacy, it was real easy. I just told the guys to look the other way, or if they went down below. If I wanted to take a shower on deck, I would use one of those little black shower things where you put the water in, it warms up on the deck. And I just sent everybody down below, and I just went out in the cockpit and did my thing. Everybody just looked the other way. Person on the helm didn't look my way, I would go behind them. So it wasn't, you just adjust to these things. And it seems weird to talk about it when you're on land. When you get on the ocean and start sailing, it's not a big deal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda. All right, Behan, are you ready?
Hi, Susanna. Hi, everybody. My name is Behan Gifford. I'm really happy to be here today and grateful to have been asked to join Nancy and join Linda in their tremendous depth of experience by adding my voice to talk about some thoughts on preparing crew for offshore sailing. Our experience with crew is that we have added a third adult for a number of significant passages and occasionally while coastal. And I'll share a couple pictures to back that up now. This is a crew that we brought on board several times, actually, a few weeks here and a few weeks there in the Indian Ocean. Her name's Aline. She did a terrific job of adding camaraderie to our boat. And here she is helping one of our daughters learn how to make crepes, which I've got to tell you is a fantastic life skill. This is another one of our crew. Ty Anderson has joined us for a couple of milestone passages. And he was someone that we actually didn't know well at all before he came on board, but knew that he was going to be a good fit based on some of the things Linda said and some of the things that I'll share with you. We also added adults or other crew at periodic times for more coastal events, which would seem very tame to us, but which perhaps are not so tame in the context of someone without a lot of sailing experience. Or minor passage making, such as going from Borneo to the Malaysian Peninsula. And then today we advise coaching clients who are future cruisers on how to find crew positions to gain additional experience. So we're advising those already out there as well, coaching clients who have recently begun cruising on how to get that extra person or a couple of bodies on board when they need it. And in both cases, whether it's our hopeful future cruiser or our new cruiser, screening for a mutual fit is really important. And that's one of the things that I want to focus on today. Hopefully you're seeing on your screen now a picture of the three kind of main takeaways that I wanted to share today through some examples and some stories. And this is me with Nancy, actually, my co-panelist and my mentor and my teacher and my friend. And it's when I was a student of hers 15 years ago this spring. I think I'm her first student to have brought a breast pump on one of her trips. During the time away from my young child. But compatibility and expectations and familiarity, I think, are three really, really important features in matchmaking with crew and in a successful crew experience on both sides. So what does that look like, and where should it start? With compatibility, figuring out how you're going to get along with that future crew, that feels a little tricky. If you're the skipper, in our case, we're a family. If we're considering bringing someone on board to be with our children, our most, precious things in the world, it's really important that we know something about that person first. So how do you find those things out? A good friend of mine models it exceptionally well, and I've now seen his tactics employed by other successful skippers finding crew. And I think it works in both directions, which is a questionnaire that actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with sailing, but works out as kind of a personality fit test. And it asks questions like, what's the best trip that you ever took? And it asks things like, how would you describe your predisposition to tidiness or cleanliness? Are you a neat freak? Are you a I know what's in those piles person? How do you handle that? What are your hobbies? What kind of music do you listen to? Do you play music? And those questions paired with the very practical ones, like what stresses you out? What are your drinking or smoking habits? What is your sailing experience? Help you paint a picture, a profile of a person that you can get pretty close to finding out, literally with a dozen questions, what kind of a fit that person might be in discussing these with them and seeing how they respond. And I think that a really simple compatibility test like this isn't really a test, it's a conversation. And it's one that you want to try to have live if possible. And technology makes that so easy today that you could be talking to someone who is half a world away over Skype or FaceTime or Zoom and have this conversation and get a pretty good sense of it before you even set foot on the boat or fly into the location that the boat exists. Compatibility on totem. Possibly was at least being able to manage small children well in once upon a time. They're not small anymore. Our son in this picture was 11. He's now 21 and a 50-ton master's. But at the time, we were crossing to the South Pacific. And the fact that our crew was willing to step up and play Neptune for us, because all of us at this point were crossing the equator for the first time. And he knew that it would be extra special for our kids that if he as the independent, as the third party stepped up to be Neptune, that he gave that little extra that Nancy talked about in the beginning, that he was the guy who was willing to put himself out there. He proved his compatibility. We knew it was there, but this is a beautiful demonstration of it. In other cases, and here's Aline again, it's the willingness to just pitch in on so many different fronts, whether it's helping our daughters learn how to cook recipes from her home, France. We learned how to make beautiful breads and crepes and all sorts of things with Aline, to new ways to share a meal together in the cockpit with some of the traditions that she brought to our family. Expectations. I think expectations are also exceptionally important in finding that successful match. And there are expectations on both sides. And we have both seen this done well, and we have seen this done poorly. And we've sometimes not done it as well as we could and learn from that experience. We think it's important to be as clear as possible about what life on board is like in advance of a crew's arrival. And we have a letter that we prepare and send out to them. And it talks about what's the water use like? What kind of power is going to be available? If you want to charge devices, is that going to be possible, or is that going to be limited? What's the routine going to be like for showering or meal preparation or doing the dishes or sweeping the floor? What are the available snacks when you're outside of mealtime? It might seem minor, but actually describing in somewhat excruciating detail is important, because jumping into life on a sailboat is a bit like walking on the moon. For someone who's never done it before, how do you really help them understand what it's like? They're going to figure out a lot after they get there, after they experience it. And the more you can set their expectations to minimize the disruption before they come to you is going to be helpful for everyone. So we help with a packing list as well that gets into some detail about the kinds of things that they should bring and the kinds of things that'll make their life easier, like their own water bottle with their name on it to make sure they stay sufficiently hydrated, having X number of water bottles per day to help stave off seasickness or make it less dangerous if they do get seasick. We talk about time frame. Expectations around time when you're cruising are a really big deal. Expectations around time mean, we think this passage is about 2 weeks long. But oh, by the way, we might be waiting for 10 days to get a weather window ahead of time, and we might get stuck for 5 days in the middle because it's not a straight A to B route. That 2-week passage could very easily be a month, and a full conversation around that can help expectations and make sure no one is stressed out or angry or frustrated. Knowing about style, excuse me, style, and what your style is like and what their style is like. Is this a boat where they want to turn the engine on as soon as the speed drops below 4 knots? And does that work for you because you want to get there too? Or is this a boat that's really just going to bob around and wait for the wind and maybe just watch the world go by for a while? And is that okay for you, or is that going to make you really frustrated? Know the style before you get on board. And then expectations around roles and responsibilities, knowing what's going to be expected of you. And I think those expectations are the really obvious ones. What are you going to do for watch keeping? What are you going to do for off watch? When actually all of these other expectations are really important as well. This is another snapshot of Ty and our Pacific crossing. And while it wasn't an expectation of him, it was a really wonderful thing that he helped with our kids, because truly for us, the reason we brought him on board on that particular passage was in large part because we knew with 3 young children that double handing was going to be a challenge, that one of our biggest risks as a relatively short-handed crew is fatigue. For any crew, fatigue is your enemy. And that by having a 3rd adult on board to assist, we knew that we had a much better chance of a happier passage for everyone on board. I want to talk last a little bit about familiarity. And familiarity takes a few different angles. When I say familiarity, I'm talking first about actually what Linda mentioned, which I think is really, really important. She talked about having SOP, the standard operating practice, having written lists, and the importance of a crew briefing. I think these are critical. That kind of information can be largely provided in advance, and that's information you should have available to you as a crew that you can study, that you can get familiar with. And it's a great indicator of the boat that you're getting on and how well prepared they are, which is an important screening tool for you as a crew. Do they have a diagram that shows where all the fire extinguishers are? Do they have a diagram showing the location of all the through hulls? Do they have cheat sheets for different things that they do on board? every captain's going to do things a little differently. They're going to do them in their own way, and every way could be correct. As long as everyone's on the same page about those practices, you have a much better chance of things being done well and being done safely. When you follow a routine, when it's that routine that's been established by the captain on board, then people coming on deck on short notice in unfamiliar events are more likely to have to do things safely and well for the good of all on board. And then familiarity. There's also a limit to how familiar you can be with any boat coming on as a new crew. So a really good rule we think to have is, if you have a question, ask the captain. If you see anything, call the captain. If you have doubts about something, maybe it's a good time to call the captain. If you're not sure whether you should get in touch with the skipper of the boat because things are just uncertain, you know what? I bet they're going to be a lot happier that you got her up than if you let her sleep and sat there and stewed and wondered. The captain is going to want to know that you're a concerned and attentive crew, and hopefully she'll be able to get enough sleep anyway. She would probably always rather be awoken. Familiarity can be the skills that you bring to the boat and how readily you're able to slide into the routine aboard the boat. And it does help to have some skills, but often the best skill you bring is your enthusiasm, your attention, your willingness to contribute, to be that person who goes the extra mile that Nancy talked about in the beginning. And we had one who did that I'm showing on screen here. Comoros gets very few visitors because it's relatively lawless. These are islands in between Tanzania and Madagascar. And we had a crew on board who spoke French, a language none of us on Totem speak with any ability. French being the primary secondary language of most Comorians. Once we actually managed to navigate the clearance system with the help of a local advocate, we were free to go to another island. And we visited this island here that you can see. There's not a whole lot there, but there is a small port captainry on shore. And they came out, and despite having, with the help of our friends and the help of our advocate on shore, having navigated clearance to be legally in the country, this new port captain felt that perhaps we were an opportunity for him to line his pockets. And our crew was able to diffuse the situation by having patience and grace and language skills, which we did not have. It wasn't the reason we brought him on board, but he made himself invaluable with the skills that he contributed. I want to touch a little on finding a boat. And this in particular because of the number of you who sort of virtually raised your hands and said in the chat group in the beginning that one of your primary goals here is getting on board a boat. And I've got a number of different tricks that I've got to share here. Grab a screenshot or come to my blog later. I think it's on the NWSA homepage or on the OLE conference page. And I'm going to put a post up later today that lists these out, so you don't have to write down like mad unless you really want to. There are a number of crew matchmaking sites, and they work with varying success. And each of them kind of has a vibe to them. There's some that may skew a little closer to dating sites, and you'll know how you want to handle those. But there's some that do an excellent job, and you may have to pay to participate in them. That's okay. It can be a really great way, and we have worked with a number of coaching clients who have found crew that they could bring on board through navigating the matchmaking sites, because they help you with a bunch of that additional or initial screening in some cases, and it's worthwhile to check out. There are a number of private resources and private venues as well, or alleys, to be able to get to crew positions. I think one good one can be by finding out where the rallies are and the timeframes that match with when you want to be able to try getting on a boat. It cracked me up, Linda, when you were talking about the catch-22. How do you get that experience, or Nancy, when you're supposed to have that experience before you go, and you know, like Linda was saying, you do a shakedown as a skipper with new crew if you can. Sometimes it's not possible. But one of the really helpful things with some of these rallies is that they're relatively coastal. You have a chance to meet your skipper ahead of time. You have a chance to do that little shakedown. And there are places to get off the boat if you need to get off the boat. And I'm thinking in particular about the first two listed there, the Coho Ho-Ho, which goes from Puget Sound down to California, typically the Bay Area, but not necessarily. And then there's the Baja Ha-Ha, which goes from San Diego down to Cabo and then La Paz every fall. And each of these have crew matchmaking portions of their website, as does the Salty Dog. And they have parties, for example, for the Ha-Ha, for crew and skippers to get to know each other. It can be a good way to suss out the personal connection that you might have, the fit that you may or may not have with a boat before you go and join that boat. And then the other two, I'll touch on another time because I'm running short on time. There are also a number of commercial vehicles, and this is what I'll put up on the website later because I know it's a lot of information, but it might be helpful to know that you can also pay for the experience and go on not having a lot of background other than knowing whether or not you get seasick, and what works for you and hopefully what your triggers are. But that all of these are great places to go for quality instruction or an experience. And a few of these, they're actually just liveaboard experiences. Join a family that's already cruising for the chance to experience what the cruising life is like. And then finally, timing is everything. We were talking about this earlier, the panelists, my other panelists and I, in terms of how to find a boat. And if you can match a departure hub with the season for major passages, it can be a really great way. The last couple of years we've been in Mexico, and where we were in La Cruz de Guanacaste near Puerto Vallarta is a major jumping off point for the South Pacific. And the hostel in town was full, and it was full of people looking for crew positions. And last year we know a number of them who's cruisers who successfully found crew from backpackers in the hostel that came there looking for crew. So it is possible on both sides. I'll put those and I'll put more on sailingtotem.com later today for you to be able to pick up and read about. I hope that the takeaways that you can have from this are that crewing is a mix of actual skills, but also real personality fit, and understanding how well you're going to connect on board is partly what you're able to bring to it, and partly what, from existing skills, and partly just the attitude that you show up with on the day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we've got 2 questions specifically for you, and then we'll go back to questions for everybody. The first one is from Joan, wants to know, do you pay these extra people for their transportation or a salary?
That's a really great question. In some, and it depends on every situation. It depends a little bit on, or mostly on, who is the needy person in this relationship? Does the boat in question really need an experienced crew? Then they may be willing to help pay for not just transportation, but even a day rate. Or do they really mostly just kind of need a warm body and you're doing it for the experience? Then you'll probably be expected to pay for your transportation to and from, and maybe even a per diem rate to contribute to the cost on the boat of being there. It's not usually excessive, but it may be enough to basically defray the cost of the boat having you on board on a daily basis.
Perfect. So our next question for you is, what is it like in Mexico now? The person asking had plans to come down, but is going to wait out COVID. Do you have any information on Baja in particular?
Yeah, I think it's smart. I mean, it's not the time to come down now anyway, as hurricane season begins. And because, assuming they're coming from California, Baja California, Norte and Sur they're technically open, the borders are open, but the states themselves are quite closed. I mean, we don't go ashore right now except one person from the boat if there's essential business. And actually on our boat, we don't even do that. We schedule a pickup of groceries at the dock and we don't even go into town. And that's what's preferred by the town and the location we're in. They're slowly starting to open up a little bit, but it's at this time, it's not a good time to come to Mexico. This fall may be a different story. I sincerely hope that by the time hurricane season is over, it'll be possible for the usual fleet to come down as they typically do.
Okay, so now we've got some questions for the panel in general. It says, how many extras of everything should you bring, especially parts? How hard is it to get replacements around the world?
That's such a wide open question. Every boat's gonna have a different situation around this, I think. What spares you need, start with a list of what's critical to you that you can or can't repair on your own and back it out from there. You simply cannot bring all of your spares with you. You can know though how readily your outboard is serviced in random faraway places or not. Your Torqeedo probably is not, but your Yamaha probably is, for example.
Let me add one thing in there, Behan. I found the cruising community to be one of abundance, even though we are very much limited in how much we can carry on board our boats. People share. And sometimes if you have a spare something that you're not using right now, you might give it to some other boat. And then when you need to spare a different thing, somebody else will give it to you. It's really a sharing place. So you don't have to be completely solely self-sufficient for every little thing. It's the beauty of cruising.
This is so true.
Absolutely. So our next question for the panel is, And we have two that are similar, so maybe can sort of start the conversation with the first one. Have you ever had a male crew who challenged your decisions and authority? And if so, how did you handle that situation?
We have had that situation, and we handled it by doing what we wanted to do. One of the expectations of crew is to be a team player and to know their role, and their role is to defer to the decisions of the skipper on board and not to override it with their own.
I was going to say that I had one situation. I had to take a fellow once from a private owner of a boat that I was doing a delivery for. He specifically wanted me to take this person, and I didn't care for the person's personality. I knew we were going to have some trouble. And he challenged me on rationing water on board. What had happened is the skipper or the owner of the boat had told me that how much water his tanks held, and it wasn't the right number. So we were actually under provision for water. And so I had to ration water to get us home. And this fellow didn't like that. But, you know, I just got in his face and I just told him under maritime law, he better listen to what I had to say, because if he didn't and he put anybody's health in jeopardy on that boat, that I'd see him in court. And I'm a maritime attorney and he'd back down.
And she is a maritime attorney, right?
Yes.
That's wonderful. So the next question goes just exactly into that. As the captain, do you feel you always have to show you are confident and in charge? How do you manage your doubts when you're in charge of a crew? Maybe Nancy?
Yeah, that's a good one for me. I'm not really a very dominant leader. I guess Behan can probably speak to that as a learner on board. But there is I guess I have a quiet confidence that shows. My tactic as a leader doesn't have to be to win the race, okay? It's because what I do is different than what Linda does, for example. She's got to drive the boat and the people to win the race. She has a different priority. Mine is teaching. And so people have come to me because they want to learn. So I don't know that I would be very skilled as a race captain, to tell you the truth, and have the crew that aren't coming on purpose to learn from me.
Wonderful. So that was our last question. Does anyone have anything else to add?
I'd like to roll it up a little bit here, if I can. I think this has been a great session. Thank you both for participating with all this help, panelists, Linda and Behan. I hope all of you still feel the ocean is calling to you, the sea's calling to you. I can't get rid of it calling me. So be careful, because once you step out there and get into it, even with the big wet dog in the small dark closet, I think you still are going to want to go again. So beware.
We just had one last question come in, and I think we have a few minutes to answer it. My first offshore race was actually great on a 60-foot vessel, despite my fracturing my foot on day one. The second offshore race was pretty awful, despite my asking what I should bring gear-wise. I was told not to worry about any of that. Once I was on board, I saw the core crew was prepared with heavy gear and harnesses to attach to life jack lines. I know better now, but would you give advice about the newbie going offshore in regards to preparation? How is it best to prepare? I would have come prepared as opposed to having to depend on other people's equipment. Does anyone want to talk about preparing with gear and other things like that for newbies?
Yeah, I'll address that a little bit. The question is a racing context and mine is a cruising context. So it's a little bit different, but maybe Linda can address the racing side of it as well afterwards. And from a cruising context, we send a really detailed letter in advance about what we have that they can use and what we don't have that they may want to bring. And it sounds to me like that was a failing in the second situation. That really is responsibility on both sides. If you're not told, you should ask. Maybe you didn't know enough to ask yet, but it's good to clarify, especially personal safety equipment, what's available on the boat, what's available for you. In our list, it includes everything from, you can use our sunscreen, towels, and shampoo if you want, but you might want to bring your own, to what we have available for PFDs and tethers. And clarifying all of that up front, I think, is a really important thing for us to do, but it's something that a crew should be able to suss out and advocate for themselves to find out in advance if it's not fed to them.
Exactly, something that we always do. I mean, race crews, especially, they're out on the deck at night. They're in horrible conditions. You don't have a choice of heaving to and sitting and waiting for better weather. So we're always pushing the boat. So as far as safety equipment, foul weather gear, we give a detailed list of what they need to bring. And I did have a person go into hypothermia once because he was told to bring sea boots. Everybody had to have waterproof sea boots for a race to Hawaii, and he didn't bring his on the shakedown, and he went into the early stages of hypothermia before I realized that he wasn't responding to questions. And I found out that he was wearing tennis shoes, and we were taking water into the cockpit, and he had cold feet in it. And even though he had foul weather gear, it sent him, it could have been a life-threatening situation.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for doing this panel. I'm going to hand it back over to Debbie.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break. I want to thank our sponsors. So we've got Offshore Sailing School, Lake Pleasant Sailing Club, Sailboats Northeast, Boat US, America's Boating Club, and Blue Water Sailing Club. And we've had some generous anonymous sponsors that were just women that wanted to see this happen. So thank you to all of those.